you didn't imagine them. Those anime, you barely remember the ones that aired once, then vanished, were real. But why did they disappear? And who decided they shouldn't be seen again? In the 1990s, U.S. TV quietly aired action anime that felt different, darker, stranger, sometimes too intense. Most were buried, edited, or erased from memory. Tonight, you're about to rediscover them, including a few that were never meant to last. The King of Braves, Gao Gaigar, 1997. This wasn't just another mecha show. Gao Gaigar arrived in 1997, bursting with an energy and intensity that made it feel like something different. The action was relentless, with over-the-top battles and jaw-dropping transformations. But it wasn't just spectacle, it had a heart. A team that fought together, powered by the idea that strength doesn't come from the machines, but from the bonds between them. This mecha series wasn't about fighting for dominance, it was about fighting for the future. For U.S. audiences. It didn't break through to mainstream success, but the series had enough power to remain unforgettable for those who caught it. It was raw, it was exciting, and it was a late-night broadcast wonder, too intense for casual viewing, but too powerful for its audience to forget. Technoman, 1992. This didn't feel like a typical hero story, and that's exactly why it stood out. Technoman dropped viewers into a war that already felt lost. The enemy wasn't just powerful, it was overwhelming. Humanity wasn't winning, it was surviving. And at the center of it all was a protagonist who didn't feel stable. Every transformation came with a cost. Every battle pushed him closer to losing control. That alone changed the tone. This wasn't clean, heroic action, it was pressure. Constant, building pressure. But when it aired in the U.S., that weight didn't always come through clearly. Edits softened the darker elements. Context was reduced. And what should have felt like a continuous descent into conflict became more fragmented. Viewers saw the fights, but not always the psychological damage behind them. Still, something remained. The intensity. The sense that this world was harsher than anything else on TV at the time. And that difference mattered, because even without full clarity, Technoman left an impression. Not as something easy to follow, but as something impossible to ignore once it started. Eagle Riders, 1996. It felt familiar, but not entirely the same. Eagle Riders arrived as another adaptation of the Gatchaman legacy, but this version carried a different kind of energy. The structure was still there, team-based combat, coordinated attacks, high-tech enemies, but the tone felt sharper, slightly more serious, slightly more urgent. And that shift made a difference, because underneath the action there was a sense that the stakes were real, not just episodic threats, but an ongoing conflict that didn't reset cleanly after every battle. But like many adaptations of its kind, Eagle Riders didn't arrive untouched. Edits reshaped the narrative, dialogue adjusted the tone. And once again, the original intent became harder to fully experience. Viewers were given a version that worked, but didn't always connect as deeply as it could have. Still, the core remained strong. The teamwork, the urgency, the sense of fighting something larger than a single episode could contain. It didn't dominate the landscape, but it stayed present long enough to leave a trace. Not as a definitive version, but as another fragment of a much larger story. SD Gundam Force, 1996. This wasn't the typical Gundam you'd expect. Released in 1996, SD Gundam Force brought a lighter take on the usually heavy Gundam series, something easier for younger audiences to digest. Instead of serious space warfare, this series used chibi designs and a more child-friendly tone while still keeping the action at a fast pace. U.S. Broadcasts took a slightly altered approach, offering an even more accessible experience. Still, it wasn't just for kids. It kept the trademark Gundam spirit, combining goofy characters with surprisingly high stakes for a show that never took itself too seriously. The series didn't dominate like other Gundam installments, but gained a niche following, especially among those who were drawn to the unique blend of comedy and action. Speed Racer X, 1997. This should have been a comeback. a modernized version of a classic name rebuilt with sharper animation and faster pacing. Speed Racer X had the advantage of recognition, but also the burden of expectation. The original had a charm, a rhythm, something almost timeless. This version tried to push forward more action, more intensity, more spectacle, and yet something didn't connect. Maybe it was the shift in tone. Maybe it was the way nostalgia collided with modernization. For longtime fans, it felt unfamiliar. For new viewers, it didn't stand out enough against the growing wave of anime entering U.S. screens. It existed in between, too new to be classic, too tied to the past to feel fresh. And in television, that middle ground is dangerous. Shows either define themselves or disappear. Speed Racer X didn't collapse. It didn't fail dramatically. It simply slipped past attention. A quiet reminder that even recognizable names aren't enough if the moment doesn't belong to them anymore. Cardcaptors 1998. Something about this one never felt right, and that's because it wasn't ISRI. What U.S. audiences saw as Cardcaptors wasn't the original story. It was a reshaped version, edited to push action over emotion. The original Cardcaptor Sakura was character-driven and balanced, but that balance was stripped away. Episodes were reordered. Arcs were altered. Emotional moments were minimized to make the show feel faster and more marketable. On the surface, it worked cards, powers, battles. But underneath, something was missing. Relationships felt rushed. Motivations felt incomplete. Viewers couldn't fully connect because the story itself had been fragmented. And when emotional grounding disappears, so does engagement. That's exactly what happened. Cardcaptors didn't fail because it lacked quality. It failed because it was never allowed to be what it truly was. What remains now is a strange version of something better. Not broken, not bad, just incomplete. And that incompleteness is exactly why it slipped from memory. Shaman King 1999. There was something inherently cool about Shaman King when it aired in the U.S. in 1999. At first glance, it felt like another tournament-style battle series. But what set it apart was the spirit world, where shamans could connect with spirits and gods to gain incredible powers. The battles weren't just about strength, they were about belief, strategy, and connection, while its U.S. airings had edits that sometimes softened its deeper themes. The emotional stakes of the show and its characters still managed to resonate. The anime's tone was a perfect balance of lightheartedness and intensity, allowing it to hit hard while remaining accessible. Though it didn't gain the mainstream popularity of other anime, it left a lasting impression on viewers who appreciated its unique, supernatural twist. The Vision of Escaflowne, 1996. This one didn't just fade, it was pulled. The Vision of Escaflowne arrived with ambition, blending fantasy, romance, and brutal mecha warfare into something that refused to stay in one category. That was its strength, until it became its weakness. The tone shifted constantly. One moment, it was introspective. The next, it dropped into intense combat with real stakes, violence, war, and psychological tension. For U.S. broadcasters, that unpredictability became a problem. Edits were made. Content was softened. But even then, it felt too complex for casual viewing and too intense for its time slot, so it disappeared. Quietly. What remains now isn't a complete memory, but fragments. A battle, a sound, a feeling that something deeper was unfolding just out of reach. That's what gives Escaflowne its power today. Not mass exposure, but impact. It felt like a story that didn't belong within television limits. And maybe that's why television couldn't hold on to it. Voltron. The Third Dimension, 1998. This was meant to be evolution, a classic rebuilt through technology. Voltron. The Third Dimension stepped into the late 90s with full CGI bold for its time, but also risky. On paper, it made sense. Modernize a known name, push it forward. But execution became the problem. The animation felt unfamiliar, rigid at times, lacking the smooth movement audiences expected. And when visuals distract, they weaken everything else: the story, the action, the stakes. For longtime fans, it didn't feel like Voltron. For new viewers, it didn't stand out enough to compete. It sat in a difficult space between old and new, and that space is hard to survive in. Still, there was something interesting beneath it: the attempt to carry a legacy forward without losing identity. It didn't fully succeed, but it didn't completely fail either. It became something else, a snapshot of a moment when animation was changing, and not every experiment was ready for what came next. Reboot 1994. It didn't look like anime, but it felt like something new. Reboot stood out immediately as a fully CGI series at a time when that alone was enough to grab attention. But what kept people watching wasn't just the visuals, it was the idea: a world inside a computer. Viruses as villains, games as battlegrounds. It turned abstract digital concepts into physical conflict. And at first, that novelty worked. But as the series evolved, so did its tone. It became darker, more serialized, less episodic. Characters changed, consequences carried forward. And suddenly, it required more attention than before. That shift created a divide. Younger viewers struggled to follow. Networks struggled to place it. And as consistency broke down, so did visibility. But looking back, Reboot feels ahead of its time. It predicted a future where digital worlds would dominate storytelling. It didn't fade because it lacked ideas. It faded because it introduced them too early. And in doing so, it became quietly influential, even as it slipped out of sight. Sailor Moon 1992. Most people remember Sailor Moon for the transformations, the poses, the glitter, and the repetition, but that is only the surface. Underneath all of that was a much sharper action formula: team combat, escalating enemies, and a constant sense that the danger was slowly getting worse. When it aired in the US, it was packaged very carefully. Softer, simpler, more innocent than it really was. But even through the edits, something stronger still came through. The villains felt darker than expected. The emotional stakes felt heavier. And every so often, the tone shifted just enough to make young viewers feel that this world was not as safe as it looked. That is what made it stick. This was not just episodic action, it was building towards something larger. But American broadcast TV often broke that momentum. Episodes were skipped, arcs were shuffled, and emotional payoff was reduced. So many viewers remember it in pieces rather than as a full story. Still, its impact remained. Because even in fragments, Sailor Moon introduced action powered by sacrifice, connection, and growth, not just force. Samurai Pizza Cats, 1990. This show should have collapsed under its own chaos. Instead, that chaos became the reason people still remember it. Samurai Pizza Cats looked, at first glance, like a standard action cartoon: fast fights, colorful heroes, exaggerated villains, and a familiar rhythm of conflict and rescue. But then, the dubs started talking, and suddenly, the whole thing became something else. The English version did not simply translate the original. It practically reinvented it. Jokes replaced missing context. References were thrown in from nowhere. Entire scenes felt reshaped by voice acting alone. And somehow, beneath that madness, the action still worked. There were battles, weapons, coordinated attacks, and real momentum. But it all felt unstable, like the show could veer off course at any second. For some viewers, that made it unforgettable. For others, it made it exhausting. Because it refused to behave like anything else on television. It did not follow clean genre rules. It did not stay consistent in tone. It did not even seem interested in continuity. And that unpredictability made it hard to market, hard to define, hard to preserve. What remains now is not just memory of episodes, but memory of energy. Biker Mice from Mars, 1993. What happens when you cross fast-paced action with outrageous humor and a team of genetically altered mice from Mars? Biker Mice from Mars was a 1,993 animated series that blended sci-fi action with motorcycle culture. offering an entirely unique viewing experience. While not strictly anime, its animation and action sequences were heavily influenced by the same styles popular in Japanese animation at the time. The series was packed with quirky characters, loud chases, and mechanical mayhem, U.S. Audiences got to enjoy the larger-than-life adventures of the three mice as they battled a villainous corporation and worked to save their home planet. Biker Mice from Mars was one of those shows that, while never a massive hit, became a cult favorite for its high-energy storytelling, hilarious one-liners, and wild, futuristic atmosphere. Zoids. Chaotic Century, 1999. At a glance, Zoids. Chaotic Century looked easy to dismiss. Mechanical animals, flashy battles, upgrades, collectibles, it gave off the appearance of something designed purely to sell toys. And that first impression probably cost it a lot of viewers, because once the story settled in, it revealed something much more serious. War was not just decoration in this world. It was the engine driving everything forward. Nations clashed, rivalries deepened, strategy mattered, characters changed because of what they survived. And slowly, what looked like a simple adventure series turned into something heavier, something marked by conflict and consequence. That shift is exactly what made the show stronger, but also harder to place on U.S. television. Viewers came expecting simplicity and found a layered war narrative instead. Some were pulled in by that depth. Others drifted away because it was not the show they thought they were getting. And once that disconnect begins, retention becomes difficult. The series did not fail outright. It just never fully captured the broad audience its surface suggested it could. But for the viewers who stayed, Zoids offered something rare. A world that treated its own battles seriously, even when everything about it looked deceptively commercial. Mobile Suit Gundam Wing 1995. This one came dangerously close to becoming much bigger than it was. Gundam Wing had scale, style, and seriousness. It arrived with giant robots, yes, but it was never just about giant robots. Underneath the action was politics, ideology, strategy, and the constant tension of characters who did not all want the same future. That complexity gave the show power. Every battle felt like it belonged to a larger struggle. Every move carried consequences beyond the immediate fight. But that same depth also created distance for some viewers. This was not the kind of series you could only half watch. It demanded attention. It expected you to remember motivations, allegiances, and shifting loyalties. And that made it harder for casual American TV audiences to stay locked in, especially when scheduling was inconsistent and episodes could feel fragmented out of sequence. Still, the impact was undeniable. It introduced a version of action anime that felt more mature, more strategic, and more emotionally layered than what many viewers were used to. It did not dominate in the way the biggest titles did, but it carved out something important. It proved that action could be political, philosophical, and intensely personal at the same time, and that left a mark. Tenchi Universe, 1995. Tenchi Universe did not announce itself like an action show. That was part of its trick. At first, it seemed playful, awkward, even chaotic in a harmless way. Strange girls appeared, absurd situations piled up, and the tone leaned into comedy so comfortably that it felt like that might be all it ever wanted to be. But underneath that humor, something larger was quietly forming. Hidden identities, interstellar power, rivalries with real consequences. And when the action finally arrived, it felt bigger because the show had taken its time getting there. That contrast gave Tenchi Universe its identity. The problem was that American television often struggled with shows that mixed tones this freely. Was it a comedy, a romance, a sci-fi adventure, a space action series? The answer was yes, and that made it harder to package cleanly. Episodes aired, but often without the consistency needed to help audiences understand its larger shape. Many viewers caught moments instead of progression. But for those who followed it closely, the payoff was there. The action was not constant, but it was earned. It hit harder because it emerged from character tension, not just spectacle. And that slower build gave the series unusual depth. Metabots, 1999. At first, Metabots looked lighter than the rest. Smaller battles, quirkier designs, a world built around customizable robots that seemed more playful than dangerous. And that first impression is exactly why it was easy to underestimate. Because underneath the humor and fast pacing was a show built on competition, strategy, and escalation. Every fight was not just about power, it was about adaptation. Tactics mattered, weaknesses mattered, and the connection between human and machine gave the action a sharper emotional core than many viewers expected. That is what made it stand out. It was accessible on the surface, but more layered once you stayed with it. The robots were fun, yes, but they were also extensions of pride, rivalry, and identity. And that gave even smaller battles meaning. When it eventually reached U.S. television, it had the right ingredients to hook younger viewers quickly: speed, comedy, upgrades, and conflict. But because it arrived near a crowded wave of monster and battle franchises, it was often treated like just another imitation. It was not. Metabots had its own rhythm, its own personality, and its own style of action, and that is exactly why the people who remember it vividly. Duel, Parallel Trouble, Adventure, 1999. It starts like a joke, but it doesn't stay one. Duel, Parallel Trouble Adventure introduces itself with awkward humor, strange coincidences, and a protagonist who feels completely out of place. Nothing about it screams action at first, but then the shift happens. Quietly. Suddenly, the world expands. Alternate realities, mecha combat. A conflict that feels larger than the character was ever prepared for. And that contrast becomes the hook. Because now, every fight feels unstable, not just physically, but emotionally. The main character isn't a trained hero. He's reacting, adapting, trying to survive something he barely understands. That gives the action a different tension. But like many anime of its time, the U.S. broadcast didn't always preserve that progression clearly. Tone shifts felt abrupt. Context felt thinner than it should have. And without that clarity, some viewers never fully locked into what the show was becoming. Still, something worked. The unpredictability, the feeling that this story was evolving faster than expected. It didn't dominate the era, but it left behind a distinct impression, not as something loud, but as something quietly strange and strangely memorable. The Big O, 1999. The Big O moved with unusual confidence because it never tried to chase the speed of everything around it. It slowed down on purpose. It built atmosphere before action, mystery before explanation. A city without memory. A lead character who felt less like a hero and more like a question, and when the giant robot finally entered the frame, it did not feel routine. It felt earned. That restraint gave the series its identity. It also made it risky. In a television environment built on instant hooks and immediate payoff, the Big O asked for patience. It expected viewers to stay with ambiguity, to connect clues, to accept that not every answer would come quickly. That is a dangerous demand in broadcast TV. Some viewers drifted before the larger shape became visible. Others stayed and discovered something richer than standard action. Because beneath the robot battles was noir. Beneath the spectacle was mood, symbolism, and a story unfolding in shadows rather than declarations. It did not explode into the mainstream because it was never built for easy consumption. But that is exactly why it lasted. Not as the loudest title of its era, but as one of the most distinct. A series that revealed itself slowly and rewarded the viewers willing to wait. Outlaw Star, 1998. If one show on this list came closest to breaking through completely, it was Outlaw Star. From the beginning, it had momentum. The pacing was sharp, the world was accessible, and the action landed fast. Gunfights, ship battles, outlaw energy, and a crew dynamic built on friction, it knew how to pull viewers in early. That gave it an advantage many others did not have. You did not need long explanation to understand why it worked. But what made it stronger was what sat under that surface. The tone could shift when it needed to. Stakes could rise without warning. Characters were allowed to face consequences instead of floating safely through the chaos. And that gave the series an edge U.S. Television was not always comfortable preserving. Edits softened parts of its identity. Scheduling weakened continuity. But even with those obstacles, it held on better than most. It did not vanish entirely, it stayed in memory. And that is what makes it feel so important now. Not fully lost, not fully celebrated, just suspended in that powerful middle space where people remember how close it came. Outlaw Star feels like a turning point. A moment when action anime in America almost found its real shape, then stopped just short. Some of these shows didn't fail. They were just ahead of their time. Buried by edits, lost in scheduling, or overshadowed by giants, they slipped through the cracks of memory. But now you've seen them again. So the real question is, how many did you actually remember? And more importantly, how many more are still out there, waiting to be rediscovered?